Meehan with Medpricer here with Joe Walsh, founder of Supply Chain Sherpas. We're talking a little bit about supply chain within healthcare providers here in the United States. And I think one question we have for Joe, given the fact that your experience spans beyond just the healthcare arena, which I think makes you particularly unique to make a big impact, is, what are the big differences you've seen between the healthcare side of things and the non-healthcare side of things, and just from a high level?
No, I appreciate that question. There's some very distinctive differences. And I'll use a quote to kind of illustrate the concept here. In other industries that I came from, and I've developed this quote over time, I would say that burning platforms are beacons of weak leaders. Another industry that I was part of would never use a burning platform to initiate action. And so I say that because a lot of times in healthcare, we're waiting, and folks even say it. When the burning platform gets hot enough, or the fire's, bright enough, then supply chain will become relevant. And if you really think about it, that's not what Apple does. That's not what Amazon does. They've not made supply chain relevant because their company's on fire. They've made it relevant and they've made it strategic because they know the power of supply chain. In fact, it's become, in their cases, strategic assets to their organizations. That's dramatically different, coming from other industries I've been part of. And I think healthcare is still in this reactionary mode where it's like, well, when the pain gets severe enough, then supply chain will matter. And I think part of that is on, executive leadership not knowing what supply chain can do, but that still comes back to supply chain not advocating for itself to say, here's what's possible. The next thing that's very different, we talked about it before, is the investment levels. The investment levels are about, even at Intermountain's level, where it's as invested as anyone else in healthcare and maybe more, it's still, 10 times underinvested relative to other leaders in other verticals. So it's still way underinvested. So there's a bottleneck that's inherent in the supply chain, no matter how good healthcare gets. Without opening the floodgates, we're probably in big trouble there. And then there's some fundamental industry differences that need to be acknowledged. And so having said that, right, here is what's different. There are some nuances in healthcare that are unique to healthcare that need to be mentioned. The first is that the folks who make decisions on a lot of these products, and I'm referring more to devices and implants, in many cases it's a physician who really influences that. And then the physician is not necessarily paid by the hospital. They may have their own independent practice and get reimbursed by the hospital, but that's not how most other organizations, that's not how Apple makes decisions, as an example. Also, you've got insurance companies involved, which means the hospital doesn't have control of its revenue stream to the same extent as other organizations do. And those are important nuances that make healthcare dramatically different with dynamics that other organizations don't have to deal with. And then this last piece that I want to mention that makes it very, very different is benchmarking. Now, benchmarking can be used to inform how are we doing, but benchmarking in healthcare is being overused to such a level that it's actually preventing us from realizing our full potential. And I say that because if we benchmark only within healthcare, and if we keep benchmarking with the transparency that we do, especially around price, then we're never going to break through the floor that we've created for ourselves around price, or the ceiling we've created for ourselves around our potential, because we're only comparing ourselves to each other. And on the price side of the equation, we're never going to get to target costing, open book cost modeling, and all these other solutions that other industries have done, because we keep sharing our pricing with each other across the industry. So inherently, benchmarking has become our friend, and used to a fault, that's what we have, right? It's become kind of our foe.
How do we fix that? I mean, how do we go about, breaking that floor and that ceiling and starting to look at ourselves in the lens of other successful supply chain organizations like an Apple, like an Amazon?
Yeah, I think it's tapping into organizations. I think Gartner does a really great job of this. There are organizations out there. Sourcing Industry Group is another organization that allows benchmarking across industries. And what healthcare has to do is kind of be willing to take its head out of the sand and say, while we have the differences, and those are nuances that need to be, I think, taken into consideration, it's not an excuse for underperforming our potential. It may be an excuse for actually not being at the same level of performance as Apple, but it's not an excuse to not even look at what's possible, right? We have built-in kind of knee-jerk reflexes that say, well, that doesn't apply. Whoa, don't go that quickly to this doesn't apply. Just recognize it all applies. The only thing we have to figure out is how do you navigate the nuance, and then what's the impact of the nuance, almost in the reverse order of how we're doing things. Because right now, no one's looking at Apple's supply chain. What we're saying is it doesn't apply, so I'm not going to pay attention to it.
Right. I think there's one other, big nuance to healthcare, and that's the reliance on GPOs, group purchasing organizations. You see it sporadically in other industries, but not like the giant GPOs you have in healthcare. What spurred the reliance and usage of these GPOs in healthcare in your mind?
Yeah, so before I get into where the GPOs are maybe causing some challenges, I want to first acknowledge that without the GPOs, and because of some of the things we've already talked about, the underinvestment in supply chain, and without GPOs, I think hospitals will be in big trouble.
Right.
It takes about 10 to 20,000 suppliers to actually manage a hospital or a hospital system. And it doesn't matter whether it's one hospital or whether it's a hospital system like Intermountain or Mayo that has multiple hospitals within it. It still takes 20,000 suppliers in most cases. So the challenge is, how many resources would you need to hire to manage that many suppliers? So when an industry is fractured and fragmented to that level, where it takes that many suppliers to run your supply chain with millions of products and services that you're actually buying to run it, GPOs help because they actually simplify that. They aggregate, forget the spend aggregation, forget the fact that they're actually aggregating to get to a lower price. They're aggregating the contracting process. They become a contracting service provider, so necessary. And until the industry continues to consolidate, I think GPOs become a very necessary component. Now, also, I think complicating that is the GPOs themselves have created a pricing mechanism for how they charge for the service that is, even for progressive organizations that probably have their own self-contracting functions, it's really interesting that how do you unplug that when there's a revenue stream that has now been created where you're getting quote unquote a free service as a hospital system for the GPO service, and then you even have a revenue stream coming back from it. I think the GPOs have been very smart, strategic at creating some incredible barriers to exit that is going to be very difficult to unplug even for some progressive organizations, and that's maybe arguably smart business on the GPO's part. Also, and I heard Jim Szilagyi say this from UPMC a number of years ago, a lot of hospital systems have unconsciously outsourced their contracting to GPOs. So if you were to say, are you aware that you've outsourced your contracting to these GPOs? I don't think most hospital systems would say, they wouldn't use that language. They would say, I just happen to use the GPO because that's the way it's always been. Where in other industries, you wouldn't have access to a GPO, and you would end up having to hire all of your own contracting people, and then you would actually form a GPO if aggregation was the right strategy in a category. This is the exact inverse. The GPOs existed as these hospitals continued to evolve and emerge. So again, it's one of those things around perspective. When you come in from outside the industry and see the GPOs and how they're so entrenched, it's why most folks from outside the industry say, how did this happen?
Yeah, I think we all see that when we first come in here. And I think, one thing is, we've talked a lot about Apple and Amazon now, and some of these organizations who make supply chain a competitive advantage. I mean, they're known for their supply chains and how they're able to quickly move product and make things happen. Will healthcare ever get there? I mean, do you see a future of independent contracting completely for hospitals? Or is that something that, healthcare isn't capable of?
Yeah, I do. I have to believe that, first of all. And as hospitals continue to consolidate, and as suppliers continue to consolidate, the actual underlying need for a GPO based on the fundamental principles we just talked about diminishes with time. That doesn't mean GPOs won't be around. That doesn't mean there's not, but I think who they serve changes dramatically. And if GPOs don't create services around the GPO offering, which all of them are trying to do, they probably die a slow death because the GPO model alone can't survive by that definition. The M&A consolidation actually takes away the fragmentation and, really importantly, the need for aggregation. So you don't need to aggregate once you're a certain size. We don't talk about this very often, but I've worked at Intermountain Healthcare and at UPMC. Both of them would be Fortune 250 companies if they were publicly traded companies. No Fortune 250 company needs a GPO because they're already big enough. They're already the economic buyer with any supplier organization in the world, right? That's not why those organizations join GPOs. So I mean, that's something that we sometimes take for granted in healthcare. There's already massive supply chain functions representing incredible amounts of spend. And so saying we need GPOs for aggregation services, we need it more for coordination services. And as supply chain gets more mature with time, and as we start accelerating that, then again, the need for the coordination of services also diminishes with time. So yes, I do see a future where many organizations, because of M&A and the progression of supply chain, have far less dependency on the GPO organizations.
You mentioned M&A, and I think that's a topic all of us in healthcare are acutely aware of at this point. It's, every day we get an announcement about a new mega merger for the next big system. How does that affect supply chain? Does that hurt supply chain's attempt to become more relevant and be a bigger factor in conversations in the health systems, or does it hurt?
Yeah, first of all, I believe that M&A is actually dramatically helping supply chain and elevating the importance of supply chain. Someday we should talk about, is M&A good for hospitals and healthcare in general, because that's a great conversation to talk about why are hospitals involved in M&A in the first place, but we'll pause that conversation for now. Because it's happening, is it helping supply chain? Absolutely. It's helping supply chain because then ultimately hospitals are coming back and saying, how do we get the value from these two organizations that we now have pulled together? And you get it either from labor, or you're going to get it from the rest of the business, which is supply chain, if you're not already getting it on the market side, which is the revenue side of the equation. So those are really the three different dimensions where you're going to actually try to create the value from: the revenue side or the cost side, and cost is going to be labor or the rest of the supply chain. So yes, it matters. Then again, this need to aggregate within the organization becomes the focus. How do you take the collective expenditures across both organizations, put them together, and then makes supply chain come right to the top of the surface for any M&A opportunity for any organization? Does supply chain become a strategic asset? It probably does over time, because as these organizations get larger and larger, they have to then look at the talent that they have leading these organizations. So a supply chain leader that was leading a $4 billion supply chain function, you have to look at that leader differently once it becomes an $8 billion organization, and ask the question: is the person focusing on their own leadership development and competency development to keep up and become the $8 billion supply chain leader, or is it time to upgrade the talent? I hope it's the former, by the way. I hope people invest in their own skills and development and don't just hope that because they were good enough at the $4 billion size that they're going to be good enough at the $8 billion size, because the complexity is actually quite different. It's not just double the size, it's double the complexity. And so we've all got to upgrade our skills. And that makes, as we upgrade those skills, not only do we better serve the supply chain, we better serve our organizations, and our organizational influence increases. So I'm very optimistic that it's going to necessitate the investment in talent development that's actually kind of backlogged right now.
Absolutely. And is that one of the things you're trying to achieve with Supply Chain Sherpas?
That is precisely the reason why I've jumped out of the leadership role, is so I can actually help people during these transitional periods of time and give all of my time and attention, my limited time and attention credits, to these supply chain leaders during that time. I don't want them to have to go tap into other industries to find those leaders. I think we take a step backwards before we go forward. But I also don't want any of these leaders in those roles to get left behind. And there's an entire generation of leaders that are in those number 2 spots that are extraordinary. I mean, absolutely extraordinary individuals. I believe in them. They're going to transform healthcare. And they need somebody to put their arm around them and invest in them and make sure that they're prepared to actually go lead healthcare into the future. And that's precisely why I decided to step out, so I could spend all of my time doing that.
Quick follow-up question to that. You mentioned that second tier of leadership that's starting to rise up. You hear a lot about millennials and how they're joining the workforce. They're getting into supply chain now too. How does the way that they think and work and interact and their reliance on technology come into play in the healthcare supply chain? Is that something that we're going to see elevate the use of technology? Is it something that we're not going to see happen anytime soon? What are some of the indicators you've seen from a coaching perspective there?
I've had, and I'm smiling because I've been so fortunate enough to be able to work with the millennial generation through a lot of internship programs, and it's some of the most rewarding work I've done. What inspires me most about the millennial generation is that if you think about them as healthcare consumers, start at the macro level first. They will not consume healthcare the same way that Gen Xers did, that I have, and certainly not the same way baby boomers are consuming it today. Assuming that the doctor is always right, that not gonna happen. Waiting for an appointment, no chance. Going in to the actual doctor's office and then waiting an hour for the doctor to be available for you, forget it, right? So, and using technology like to interact with your healthcare provider to not only schedule, which is the easy stuff, but I mean to literally interact is just gonna become the base expectation. And if hospital organizations don't not only recognize that shift, but move faster than the disruptors, the millennial generation is actually going to become the reason why hospitals face the innovator's dilemma and either fail or win. That's what I find and they're a big enough generation to matter, where Gen Xers weren't big enough to matter. That's what I find really fascinating about them. And then within the supply chain, and as an employee population, and I'll keep it simple because there's 20 things to list about the millennial generation that you can be inspired by. What I love is their commitment to purpose. They want to do something very purposeful. They want to be part of something bigger. And when you actually can activate that and help them belong to something bigger than just themselves, which is what they deeply want, then look out. And healthcare has the potential to become that type of industry, and supply chain has the potential to become that type of function and that type of career for these folks. I mean, what better opportunity is there?
Yeah, and as a millennial, I can verify the fact that with a 10-month-old baby, when my wife leaves the pediatrician's office, she's already Googling and double checking exactly everything that they say. So, that's spot on.